Really quickly, as we get kicked off here, just quick show of hands. I'm not going to do this all through the presentation. I know those sometimes feel a little bit awkward, but who in the room feels like they work for either a very large or a regulated enterprise type company right now? All right. One more quick show of hands. Who is struggling to adopt the DevOps mindset in that very large regulated company? Sweet. All right, you're in the right room. Okay, so I like to set stages. So when I talk about this framework, this methodology, and this approach, it actually resonates. It's not just me going through and showing you a picture and saying this is how it works. There has to be context and there has to be purpose. And as Justin said, I work for a company called Contino, and I'm not going to go through and do a sales pitch because I'm not a sales guy, but I do want to make sure that you understand the stance that I'm coming from. And how, when I say this is a proven methodology, it's not like we're going out and we're talking to some startups or we're talking to some mid-market level customers. We're really talking with some of the largest, the biggest, the baddest, most heavily regulated global companies in the world. So places where the real DevOps mindset doesn't necessarily always resonate. And this methodology we're going to talk through today has been born and bred and proven in that space. So Contino as a whole, we're in 7 different countries, 7 different offices across the globe. We're in APAC, we're in Europe, we're in North America. And the other piece that's kind of important is, as a company, we've delivered over 100 engagements using this exact framework. And then individually, the most junior person in Contino probably has about 10 years of enterprise DevOps delivery. So you add additional engagements outside of that. Just the really quick, required, these are the logos that we kind of work with. So here's some hand-selected ones. Again, we're not really talking about really small companies. Most of these are going to be banks, insurance, government, otherwise heavily regulated organizations. So this DevOps mindset that we're going to work through today in this talk was applied at a company called Allianz. Allianz, if you don't know, is one of the largest insurance companies in Europe. And we literally, the CIO of Allianz wrote a white paper talking about the engagement that we had with them. And in that white paper, he talks about how his internal team, using internal methods and internal frameworks, was talking about a 2-year entry point into the equine market, which is apparently a very large market to be in the insurance world, and leveraging this DevOps model and the AWS partnership that we have allowed them to enter that 400% quicker and start accessing that $300 million line of business. I promise you this is the most wordy slide that I'm going to put up on the screen, and I promise you I'm not going to read it. But this actually just helps set that frame. Like, what did we have in front of us? How did we address it? And what were the outcomes, right? So at the end, what we really did is we gave them a repeatable infrastructure, a repeatable model that allowed them to continuously drive value and return on investment from the DevOps practices that we built into the Allianz team. So how do we do this? First and foremost, we have an engineering-first approach. And when we talk about DevOps, if you're in the room, you probably have an understanding of why I say engineering first is important. But everybody in the Contino organization and nearly everyone that we work with is or has been a practicing engineer in some form or fashion, because that's kind of important to understand the barriers. But you also have to be able to communicate and make sure that you're inviting the stakeholders and the wrapper services into it. We use the DevOps operating model. We kind of demystify what that means, because when you talk about DevOps, you can ask 10 different practitioners what it means, and you're probably going to get 13 different answers. So what we do is we help people understand what that means in their context and how can we continuously move towards a more DevOps type mindset. But we also have metrics and a business case driven approach. So I think it was Deming that said that which is measured is improved. So the only way that we know that we're actually making forward progress with any framework, with any mindset, with any initiative, is to actually have core measures around it and to see how we're actually advancing those needles. And then the thing that kind of makes Contino as a company important, but it also translates to the internal consulting that happens in large enterprises, is the idea of pragmatic dual delivery. And what I mean when I say that is, any XP practitioners in the room? Anybody familiar with extreme programming? Okay. So there's this concept called I saw one hand, so I'm going to explain this for a second. There's this concept called extreme programming, where you have 2 or more knowledge workers working together on the same task. And the idea is that 2 brains working on the same problem at the same time creates a better outcome than having one individual brain working on the problem. The same actually works, like that's how we all learn. If you think about tying your shoe. Nobody gave you a checklist to tie your shoe. You worked with somebody else, probably your parent or your teacher, on how to tie a shoe, how to ride a bike, how to speak a language. All of these things happen in a pairing situation. That's how we instill the mindset and the practices of DevOps within organizations, and that's how you can do it within your own enterprise. And then Contino is actually very fortunate. We have some really strong strategic partnerships with AWS, with HashiCorp, with Docker, and with Kubernetes. So we have the ability to really leverage some heavyweight power there too. All right, what is a framework? When we talk about the model that Contino has proven over time, it's really good to start with what the hell is a framework in the first place. So typically we'd think of them as a structured process, a means for governance. So how can we start wrapping some controls around this structured process? And really what it means is we're trying to take something which is relatively unknown and hard to predict, i.e. software development, and make it predictable, right? That's really what we're trying to do at the end of the day. We're trying to set up something that radiates information in a predictable fashion so that we can de-risk an initiative. When we started talking about, the first framework that really kind of emerged in the software delivery space was Waterfall. It's sometimes called the predictive model. Waterfall tends to be a trigger word sometimes, but most people are familiar with this. It's where you set the requirements up front, you go through a design document, implementation, testing all the way through. I did a lot of time in the Oracle world, working embedded within enterprises, doing Oracle deployments, migrations, upgrades, and all of that good stuff. So I have the scars to prove it if anyone wants to see later. So these are like your MD50s, 70s, MD120 documents. That really follows through that waterfall model. We eventually said, okay, this seems like we're doing a whole lot of work up front and we're compromising quality as we go through it. So there's got to be a better way. That's when the rational unified process came into play. Anybody rational? RUP? Any RUP practice? My XP guy and another guy, cool. All right, so RUP was an idea of trying to figure out how can we take this highly complex, highly diverse waterfall type approach and normalize it against software development. And we started bringing in additional pieces, and we tried to get a little bit more adaptive and incremental, and then they started switching into the mindset that you can pick and choose the pieces of RUP that make sense, but you have to stay true to these specific areas of the framework. But what happened after RUP was a bunch of people started saying this isn't good enough for regulation, and ITIL really became kind of prevalent. But ITIL was always around with Waterfall as well, and it's still around today. So a lot of organizations are probably ITIL organizations in the room, or at least have heard of it and tried to adopt ITIL. Around 2000, 2001, a group of software engineers and management consultant type people said enough of the madness, there's got to be a better way to do these things, and they formed the Agile Manifesto. It happened in 2001 out in Snowbird, Utah. 17 guys got together and basically said, this is not how software is meant to be built. We're literally trying to throw out a plan and then develop against the plan rather than develop against outcomes. One of the biggest frameworks that emerged out of the Agile Manifesto was Scrum. I'm going to assume a lot of folks have heard of Scrum and you know what a Scrum Master is, and I think at this point it just means you're using Jira and you stop using hours and talk about story points, yeah? Yeah. So Scrum is really good in that it gives you a lightweight method to start developing software in a somewhat predictable and digestible format. What it doesn't do is it doesn't speak to the enterprise. And a lot of times people think that Scrum is more geared towards startups, small scale companies, and it's not big enough for the enterprise. So we'll do that instead. We'll just take this little Scrum thing and we'll blow it up into this giant picture. And when you look at this, and if you haven't seen SAFe before, the Scaled Agile Framework, that's what this is. When you look at this and you decompose it and you look at all the different pieces that comprise SAFe, it's quite a bit, and it gets a little bit more heavyweight. And we're probably regressing a little bit back towards the RUP world because of the number of roles and the number of governance and powerful leverage that's really top heavy in this space. Next, there was an answer to SAFe, which was a less oppressive, heavyweight agile framework that's called LESS, so less evil, I guess. And less is basically the same thing. They're trying to take the core principles of Scrum and spin it up so that it's more comfortable and acceptable in the enterprise space. One thing that's kind of universal through all of those frameworks that we just talked about is that we've actually lost an engineering focus. You see a lot of project management type roles, a lot of governance type roles, a lot of just general management roles, and we're getting further and further away from core engineering practices. The things like unit testing, the things like immutable infrastructure, the things like compliance as code, all of the things that actually make it able for us to be those disruptive, quicker time to market type organizations is slowly and slowly getting pushed outside the bounds of what we're writing into the actual frameworks that we're working against. And then we wonder at the end, why do we have security issues? Why do we have quality issues? Why is it taking longer and longer for us to get our software to market and realize that return on investment? So, what that's kind of led to recently in the last 5 to 10 years is this idea of DevOps, and how can we start bringing those engineering practices back into the spotlight so that we're engineering them back into the process, that we're actually having quality first thinking, and that we're actually removing wasteful operations, we're automating things away. So why is it that organizations like to think in a much more DevOps type mindset? To accelerate deployment times, to reduce time to market, minimize, it's a lot of these reasons are going to be cost-driven reasons. When you look through this list, it's why do we want to do more engineering first practices? Because it's actually going to give us the things that we thought we were getting with these other frameworks, but we're going to do it in a much more meaningful way, and we're going to be able to express this as code. So, the framework that you were all promised when you swiped your badges to come into this room today is called Momentum. And this is the proven framework that's come out of over 100 engagements with Contino. It's a data-driven transformation approach. It's not jazz hands, and it's not a whole bunch of coaching that does not actually produce any measurable outcomes. It is 100% measurable, and it's 100% immersive. That said, it's also pretty lightweight, and we're going to step through all of that today. 4 base ingredients is the idea of transforming people, process, and technology in that order. We need to first focus on people, what level of skill they have, what their calibration and their communication models are, the process that they follow today to reach production, and then what tools are we using, and are we using them appropriately, and are there other options to use different tools? We already talked about dual delivery, which is that pairing piece that I talked about in the beginning. This framework also requires an upskilling mandate so that when there are skill gaps in the people and the process, we have an opportunity then to actually recalibrate back into them. And it's a training exercise as much as it is a delivery exercise. So you're continuously improving the operating patterns of that organization. It's DevOps through and through is really, I mean, that's going to be no secret as we go through this. And we have a model called Lighthouse Projects. What it means is that we are building in small proof points. And when I say small, I usually quantify it in the enterprise as 3-month turnarounds of something that has strategic value to the organization in a production-like capacity. So we're not talking about those 6, 9, 12, God forbid, 18 or 24-month big bang projects. We want to put ourselves and our teams on the line every 3 months so that we can actually prove out these things that we're talking about are not just generating value, they're generating real strategic value for the enterprise. That's the only way that we're actually going to see this get adopted into the culture and the lifeblood of an organization. So when I talk about DevOps, and I think when you talk to some of the thought leaders in the DevOps space, we're not talking about Jenkins, we're not talking about Docker, we're not talking about AWS, we're not talking about pipelines. We're actually talking about people, process, and technology. And I kind of paused on that on the last screen. When we talk about people, we're talking about how is that organization structured. Anyone familiar with Conways Law? Yeah, cool. Conways Law says, I did see some hands. So Conways Law basically says the software that we build mimics the organizational structure that we have in the company. So if we have a highly siloed organization where people are barred from talking to each other, our software is going to be pretty monolithic and pretty barred from itself. It's not going to be expressed in services and easy to integrate and nimble, right? If your organization moves slowly, I'm willing to bet a beer at the open bar after this that your software moves pretty slowly. When we talk about the process, it's really how are we taking concept to cash today? How long does it take for one line of code to go from developer machine to production. Chances are it takes a little bit of time if you're working in a large enterprise. The good news is it doesn't have to be like that. There's a means to get there faster. When we talk about the technology, it's the tools that we're using today. Sometimes not sometimes, quite often we're usually working with organizations that have large monolithic architecture that's really difficult to make changes to. So how can we make that less painful? How can we automate away some of the painful pieces? Just because of where we are today in recent news and technology, in the technology space, in this model, there's a lot of focus right now on regulatory and on security and data privacy, right? I don't have to say anything more beyond that, but this is really where you need to take a gut check of, okay, what are we doing to protect our secrets, our keys, our customers' data? If you're working in a regulatory space where you're supposed to be PCI compliant, HIPAA compliant, FDA compliant, or any of the other regulatory compliancies, are we just hoping that we're compliant, or are we actually doing something about it to make that compliancy as code a reality? If we're just hoping, this is an opportunity for us to inspect that and figure out how can we get stronger. When we go through and we actually take a people-first approach, focus on the process that's being used and the technology that's being leveraged to actually deliver that process, we're actually talking about the sustainable culture of an organization. Every organization has a culture today. We may not be proud of the culture that we have, but when we talk about change, we have to take in these elements so that we can come up with a better culture that actually is sticky in that organization. So, upskilling focus, again, quickly, it's really taking two minds working on the same problem so that we're bringing cohesion and we're actually bringing dual learning. So, from a consulting stance, when we come in and we do the dual delivery and the upskilling, we're learning context about that organization so that we can make the engagement much more strong. From an internal enterprise stance, it allows for people to drive empathy between their teams. If I'm an engineer and I'm working with another engineer, I make a lot of assumptions about A, their background, B, their level of skilling, and C, their thought process. If I sit with that person and I pair with that person for 60 to 90 minutes, a lot of those assumptions get proven or disproven, but I have better empathy and a better team thereafter. Momentum, it has a couple of core principles. First and foremost, super lightweight. You'll see it, I think, on the next slide or in a slide or two. I think you'll agree that it's pretty straightforward and lightweight. That's done intentionally so that if you have a larger organization that's leveraging things like ITIL or leveraging if you're leveraging some of the agile models, momentum actually gracefully fits into this. It's built for scale. It's really difficult to have a lightweight model that also then scales to hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of engineering and delivery folks, but it is possible, and we've actually proven that time and time again in very large organizations. It's holistic in that it's engineering first, but it wraps around the services. So when we start making things go to market faster, when we build these CI/CD pipelines that allow for multiple code pushes to production, multiple times an hour, multiple times a day, it actually changes the paradigm that our product management organization, our business folks, and our funding teams have to, it changes their reality. So we need to make sure that the model that we're talking about includes them into that conversation so that when we change their reality, they're actually suited to work in a much more better way. Also, it focuses in on that auditing space, right? When we have our internal, external auditors coming in to make sure that we're being compliant with the regulatory constraints that we have, I'm thinking of my SOX friends, what happens if we stop using Excel checklists that, let's be honest, are mostly accurate, and we start switching over to log files? How do we bring those people in so that they understand what that change is? Why is that change actually better to audit a log file than it is to audit an Excel spreadsheet? Opinionated, if I haven't convinced you yet that I'm an opinionated person and that I like to work with an opinionated framework, we still have 27 minutes and 56 seconds for that to happen. But this is an opinionated framework. It was bred from the enterprise. It was bred through prior success. It's measurable. I'm going to go back to Deming one more time. That which is measured is improved. So if you don't have analytics, metrics, and proof points built into a process, there's no way to tell, are you actually on target, because you have no target, and there's damn sure no way to say, are we actually improving? So having the right metrics built into a model and into a framework is super important so that you can actually not just know when you're off track, but start to predict when you start going off track as an organization. 5 simple steps. So The next slide, we're actually going to go into the framework. What I want to do before we get into that is talk about the giant pieces that make up the framework. The first thing is nurturing it. And when I go and I consult, or even before I was in actual consulting, I came out of the enterprise. The first 17 years of my career was literally working in the large, heavily regulated space. I've only been doing this consulting thing for this year. This does not change from internal consulting for people that work in the enterprise to external consultants. You need to reach a shared understanding of what the hell it is you're trying to do. Otherwise, there's a lot of assumptions and bad information and bias that comes in. So when we talk about nurturing something, are we all talking about the same problem? Or are we actually talking about a symptom or a problem? And what does better actually look like, right? Once we have a common understanding and a shared language, we can then start talking about how are we going to execute against that problem statement that we have. And here we talk about some lightweight planning. We try to figure out, okay, what strategic outcomes do we want to accomplish, and how do we think we're going to accomplish that? But we allow some variability because we only know so much right now, and once we start getting the teams together, they're going to learn a whole lot more, a lot faster. Proving it is quite simply my favorite stage. It's where we actually get to deliver. Proving it is when we take that plan and we try to chunk it down into something that is as quickly deliverable as possible. I've seen projects that have been delivered in 3 to 4 weeks. Typically at the enterprise scale, we're talking about things that are going to be delivered in 3 months. Feels slow sometimes to me, but when you're talking about large, heavily regulated banks or financial institutions, insurance companies, nothing really gets done in 3 months. You can't even usually get a business case approved in 3 months, but we want to build things that we can deliver in 3 months so that we can continue getting the momentum and the forward progress so that we're delivering things of value and we're showing that value back to the organization in real time. And then we want to make sure that it's scalable. With momentum, we'll go through it and you'll see it, but the idea isn't to just run 3-month projects. It's how do we create sustainable cultural change across a very large organization that likely made billions of dollars doing things in a legacy model. And now here we are saying we're going to do it a different way, and we're going to threaten that, but we need to do it in a way that's digestible, understandable, and consumable. Improving it is also super important. This whole journey talks about us coming up with a shared understanding of something, a plan to accomplish that shared understanding, proof points and scaling, but we're wasting our time if we think that one example of success is going to continuously sustain. That's actually what got us to this point, ignorance to the changing environment in front of us. So what we need to do is we need to constantly inspect and adapt and loop back to the nurture it phase when we find an improvement opportunity. In the world of lean, we call that Kaizen, but in the world of the enterprise, we call that common sense. All right, so the framework itself, we're gonna step through that sort of quickly here, but this is the framework on one page. When we talk about the nurture it phase, it's exactly what we just kind of went through. We're talking about problem alignment and stakeholder education, making sure that we have a common understanding of the problems that are in front of us and that we did a real true root cause assessment of what that problem is. We're not just guessing and we're not including the right, we're trying to make sure that we're not just guessing, and we want to make sure that we're inclusive of the proper stakeholders. We then go down into that planet phase, and this is where we do things like maturity assessments, and I'll talk a little bit about a maturity assessment in a second. We're talking about building out our strategies. If we're looking to build DevOps as a mindset into an organization, what does that mindset look like? If we're looking to leverage something like containerization or microservices, or we want to build out a cloud strategy, a multi-cloud strategy, a hybrid cloud strategy, whatever that is, let's come up with an understanding of what that is and start to plan that out. And then because we're talking about enterprise level change here, we usually need to have a business case for these types of things. Because we're looking at 3-month deliveries, this nurture it and plan it phase usually boils down to about 2 to 3 weeks. We're trying to do these things relatively quickly, which means we're trying to scope into a very small piece of the organization and drive a spike straight through that so we can deliver change quickly. The prove it phase is exactly what I talked about in the Lighthouse project. We're going to build a cross-functional team of engineers that are interested in taking this change initiative all the way through to production, right? Scaling it, typically what happens in the scaling it phase is that we take that one thing that worked, that one team that worked, and there's a technique called seed and split. You seed that idea into multiple people, you split that initial team or the initial set of teams into 2 or 3 more teams, restaff it with other delivery folks that are interested, and run that simulation again. So now you have 4, 5, 6 project teams delivering in this new way of working, and they're starting to see returns in 3-month increments here. So you can see if you do that exercise 2, 3 times, you're then spawning off more and more teams that are operating in this new model. Once you start getting some scalable traction in that space, you can then actually build out roadmaps that matter, not just guesses that you draw in December that tells you where you're going to land in the following December. Additionally, you can build out things like a better operating model. Again, I talked about cultures. Every organization has a culture, whether they're proud of it or not. Every organization has an operating model, whether they're proud of it or not. So what we can do is we can actually take a step back and say, what is the operating model that we want to start gearing towards? If we put a rudder on that ship and we talk about what better looks like and we can quantify that, it's meaningful and powerful. Because of the stance with Contino being a DevOps organization, we love to talk about DevOps centers of excellence. And what that really is, it's a model. As much as we learn from pairing, we learn from models. And we can actually set up a center of excellence for people to go to with questions, problems, or to get artifacts and learning. We can set up some bespoke initiatives and set up a DevOps Academy or a Cloud Academy, somewhere for us to get continued learning. And last but certainly not least is the improve it phase that we spoke about. And this is really our opportunity for continuous improvement. But this is when we start building in things like, we do like program level retrospectives. When we say, is there another change initiative that we want to start nurturing to bring back through the pipeline? This is an opportunity for us really to take a deep breath, a look in the mirror as an enterprise organization and say, how can we do better? Cool, let's start executing against what better is. All right, when we talk about the nurture, we're going to step into each one of those 5 phases a little bit deeper here. When we talk about nurturing it, we're trying to bring together stakeholder alignment, and we're trying to make sure that we have a sharing of the minds, that we're actually defining the problems, and that we're bringing in the right people at the same time. I'm going to drop a lot of lean here, I think, but there's another lean technique called the 5 whys, which is when you ask somebody what their problem is, they give you an answer, and if you ask why 5 times, you actually find out what the real problem was. It's not what they're expressing, it's actually what they're meaning. This is an opportunity to figure out what the enterprise level problems are. When we talk about the planet, the qualities of the project that we want to build out is that we have an assessment, a strategy, and a business case. Those are the 3 legs of the stool that actually bring about a change initiative in the large regulated enterprise. When we're building out those lighthouse projects, there's certain qualities that make up all of these 3-month type projects. The first one is that it's 3 months. It's a short delivery, especially within the enterprise space. If you work for a company that allows you to deliver a project soup to nuts in less than 3 months, or you can scope in on a problem that can be delivered in the enterprise in less than 3 months, do that. Definitely do that. We want to make sure that it's cross-cutting. So a UI project is not really cross-cutting, or a database project is not necessarily cross-cutting. We want to make sure that we're delivering full stack solutions, because the only way you're going to get real strategic value for an enterprise is by delivering something that touches all pieces of the business. We want to make sure that we have an available team that's willing to work together, right? If you have partial team members, if you do not have a bought-in team, you're going to be spinning your wheels. Delivering real outcomes, we talked about a couple times. It's really hard to get a business case if you don't have outcomes attached to it. Usually those outcomes are expressed in return on investment. Other times it may be time to market type things. It may be entering new markets or things of that nature. We'll make sure it's measurable. I've hit this a couple times, but if we're not actually making sure that we're making forward progress, or we're not able to predict when we're going off the course, then what are we actually doing? Are we just going through the motions? And one thing, I'm often asked, how are you able to do these things in a large company? And it's actually a multi-pronged answer, but one of the single thematic similarities that happens across all successful change initiatives I've seen in large, heavily regulated enterprise is you got to have at least one executive owner that's willing to buy in and go to bat for you. If you have to wait till every 3rd Wednesday to punch a hole in the firewall, you need the guy or girl that is able to say, no, bullshit, we're going to do that tomorrow because we need it open tomorrow. So if you can find that executive that's willing to help you punch holes through the organizational bureaucracy, you are set up for significant success. So when we talk about scaling it, we're taking those qualities that we just talked through and we're spinning it off into multiple teams. We're going to start spinning up we're going to do the seed and split technique, and we're going to start rolling it out. But we want to make sure that we're paying attention to those teams as we spin them up. This is actually it sounds simple, right? It's basically taking that model and just saying, oh, we're going to do more of that. It takes a lot of attention, focus, and desire to make sure that each of those teams express the same qualities as the initial team that proved success. When we talk about improving it, it's kind of funny. I was watching some of the earlier talks today, and I think this slide has been shown in a bunch of different talks in just different formats. I don't know if anyone's got my color scheme, but we want to make sure that we're doing this in a sustainable pace. We want to start with a walk type approach, making sure that the engineering and the delivery practices are nurtured, and that the hygienical problems that should be addressed, do we have the right kit for the developers? Do we have the right software? Do we have the right access? All of those things are sorted. When we talk about the running, we're starting to establish KPIs that allow us to actually change in a much more proactive manner. So are we starting to sense problems before they actually manifest themselves? Are our measurements being appropriately established, and are we sharing them in a meaningful way? And then finally, once we really get an enterprise into a DevOps mindset, the tooling and the processes, you don't know when you're stepping into a tool or when you're stepping into a process, because everything is so tightly integrated that it works like a concert. Quite often our process is dictated by our tools. We'll go out and buy an ALM tool, and that ALM tool will come with a pre-cooked workflow, and that becomes our workflow. In a sprint type team, those the workflow is not defined by the tool. The tool is actually defined by the process itself. So I talked about DevOps assessments. One thing that's really important is understanding the health, the well-being, and the opportunities for us to improve our teams. And the one way that Contino does it is we actually have a really cool assessment tool. It's called DevOps Maturity. You actually, if you guys are interested in it, there's no cost. It's free online. It's DevOpsMaturity.com. But it allows for us to actually apply measurables against things that are pretty difficult to measure. How healthy, how strong, how resilient is a team, and how does that change over time? Taking one measurement is good. That's a really good starting point. You now have a baseline from which to measure. How does that change over time, and how can we experiment against that to see what the outcomes are? Are we improving things in the DevOps space? This is an example of the different types of assessments that we run. The idea here isn't so much in the tool, it's in the idea that we're taking our time to actually figure out that we need to measure these things, we need to ask the questions. No matter how, like the first time you go through any assessment, it's literally one of the scariest things that you're going to do, because you're starting to learn how the sausage is actually made. It's not this theoretical idea of how the teams are operating and the level of skilling in the team. It's actual data that tells you, and measurements that tell you how the team is behaving and operating. So, some insights that we can draw from this talk, I hope, is that it's super important to create a shared vision so that we're talking about the same things in the same way. We're creating a shared language. We like to target smaller projects so that they're deliverable in tight windows. That way we can continuously demonstrate value to our stakeholders. We like to create cross-functional teams. That means everything from the technical stack as well as insights into the market, so that we have the proper product people in place that can prioritize the work. We want to make sure that we're focusing on strategic value and outcomes. I challenge you guys, when you go back to your enterprise jobs, when you go to pitch the next business case internally, the outcome isn't that next screen or that next service or even DevOps. The outcome is much deeper than that. Like, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? We're not trying to roll out some more code, we're actually trying to solve a strategic problem. Let's actually focus in on what that problem is, because then you're actually talking about the why behind the effort, not the what. And it's really easy for us to fall into the trap of talking about the what. Continuously inspect and adapt. If you're in this room and you're curious about DevOps, or you're curious about Lean and Agile, this is one of the core tenets of all three of those mindsets. And the only way that this stuff actually influences corporate culture, which again has probably been established over multiple decades, is by being holistic, making sure that we're inviting everybody into the conversation and that we're not just spiking in on one space. So, frameworks should be focused on engineering and learning. And engineering doesn't always just mean computer programming. There's other areas of engineering across the organization. We want to make sure we follow that people, process, technology structure and stance. We want to make sure that we stand on the shoulder of giants. This, again, seems relatively simple, but this is actually the only sustainable process that we've actually figured holds true when we step through over 100 plus enterprise level engagements. For the change to be everlasting and evergreen, it needs to become sticky. And for that to become sticky, we need to make sure that it actually ties into the heartbeat of the organization. And then going back to the pairing and going back to the modeling, applied learning is way stronger than didactic learning. And didactic learning is me telling you how to do your job versus me doing your job with you. And there's actual learning that happens when you're doing it together. One final thing, we have a free community. It's a Slack community. If anybody's interested in DevOps, there's no marketing. It's literally a common space for anybody interested in the DevOps community, all the way from what the hell is a container, all the way through how can I handle multi-cloud container orchestration, or how do I handle multi-cloud in the government space. All of those conversations happen free and open in this community. I say check it out, register. It's a Slack community it's global, and we have some really strong people that are included in that space.